Hello and welcome to yet another Human Synergistics live stream. Thank you to those of you who are joining. Very happy to talk with you today on yet another interesting topic with a fascinating guest. So today I'm very happy to welcome Louisa Robb. Ms. Robb has had her own consulting and coaching practice since leaving finance in 2011. She works with companies, teams, and individuals across industries and across geographies to help them understand themselves better and to improve outcomes, both business and personal. She uses human synergistics tools, is accredited in the entire suite for much of her work, and has experience across all of the offerings. So very much looking forward today to hear from Ms. Robb on her experiences using human synergistics tools to create that positive change that we're all about. Thank you so much for joining us today, Louisa.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So today, before we bring up the slide deck, I'm going to talk about an experience I had several years ago, one that's actually been repeated in different forms over the past years of me using these tools. I'm going to take about 20 minutes and kind of cover what the situation was, what tools and processes I used, and what we would have expected to see as an outcome, and then what actually happened. And I'll try and cover off some lessons that the client took away and also some that I took away.
Thank you.
So please.
No, I just thank you for the content. This is the sort of thing that I get questions all the time about. Once people understand the tools and their potential, then their next questions are, really, how do we put this into effect, and how do people learn from this? How do we communicate it? All of those are key best practices. So just excited. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. So I think we'll probably kick off with a slide deck, maybe.
Shall we then? Very good. Oops. Oh, goodness. Sorry, let me
go back to the start. We can say thank you, though.
Sorry for that. I'm not sure how that happened.
Oh, good. That was a sneak preview to make sure people were really excited.
That was just a tease. Very good. Very good.
Good tease. Okay, yes. Perfect. All right, so let me start with what we're going to do. So as I said, about 20 minutes. I'm going to explain what the situation was, which human synergistics tools I used and what my process was, what expected and experienced outcomes I saw, lessons for both myself and for the client, and then we'll have the chance to take questions in through the chat.
Yeah.
So, what happened? As I mentioned, this took place several years ago. It was the first time for me as a consultant that I kind of experienced this, but it's certainly not been the last. I had a mandate from a senior management team with over 4,000 staff. I was working with their top 11 managers from their executive committee. The context was a new operating model, and they were a service function which needed to adapt to the changing organization. Something that happens obviously quite regularly for a lot of our clients. They have to be in service to and understand how to adapt to change. You see there in the first column, I'd actually done the LSI 1 and 2 for these individuals in the preceding few months. And this was where it was all going to come together. I'd had one-on-one debriefs with each of the individuals in the executive team who had completed their LSI 1 and LSI 2. And this offsite over on the right there was where everything was kind of meant to come together and set them up for success going forward. So I had an afternoon only at their offsite. I think they were offsite for a few days, and I'll just run through what we did. So at about 3 hours, I kind of set the scene. I reminded them about their LSI 1 and 2 and the debrief. I gave them their LSI team composite score. So that is the average and the presentation of how the team looks with the various extensions around the circumflex wheel. So that was kind of a nice way to sort of frame where they had stronger or more common consistencies, let's say. The boss actually shared her personal LSI1 and LSI2 in one of those very helpful, trust-building kind of experiences for the team. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. And she genuinely was very much leaning into this process, which I think kind of helped dispel any cynicism or frustration at going through the process of having to complete a lot of surveys. She was really talking about what the feedback for her had meant and how she wanted for herself to be accountable for some behavioural changes going forward. So that was really helpful. I explained to them a little bit about the thinking behind Patrick Lencioni and his understanding of team dynamics. I used that as a setup for what the bulk of today's presentation, which will be about, is about survival simulations. So I kind of primed them to behave well. We then reflected on what happened in the survival simulation, and it led to this team creating a charter for themselves going forward.
Very good.
Thank you. So let's talk about the process and the tools that I actually used. Okay, so before we dive into reading some of that text, let me give you a little bit of context. So after we talked about the team composite score and after the boss had shared her LSI 1 and 2, I set them up for this survival simulation. I told them that I had assigned them teams, and I prefaced the whole lead-in with a call for them to reflect on their own LSI 1 and 2 reports and what we discussed one-on-one about where their behaviours were more or less helpful. In other words, they were really primed to think about how they were going to interact with one another. I said to them to be really aware of what they were doing, be conscious, and think about doing better. So in the middle of this slide, I've just put in the LSI circumplex. And for those people who are familiar with what's in there, that's fantastic. For those who aren't, obviously it's very detailed, but let me at least give you this. We have where the red extensions are and the number 11, which is almost visible at the top blue. This is the sort of task side of the task hemisphere of the circumplex. And on the other side, where you have number 5, 4, 3, and 2, and even up into number 1, this is the people side more of the circumplex. So when it came to splitting the teams, I actually leaned on those two hemispheres in terms of the dominance of this group of 11 managers. So having a look there on the left, I grouped together those who had a task hemisphere bias in their LSI 1 and LSI 2. They were much stronger in those red aggressive defensive styles in their LSI 2. So the LSI 2 is the perception of others about that individual's behavior. Their constructive average score was at the historical median, so at that thick black bar around the 50th percentile. So both on the LSI 1 and LSI 2, they both thought they were sort of pretty average at average levels for constructive behavior and thinking. Half the team had power, which is what I would call a very Trumpian style, this very forceful, domineering, powerful way of using one's rank or authority, especially in hierarchy, to kind of force things through and kind of demand respect and power from individuals. 3 of the 6 team members either had power above the 90th percentile in their LSI 1 or as reported by others in their LSI 2. So there's quite a lot of power in the team, which is why I called it the power team. And interestingly for me, over this team, they overestimated their constructive affiliative behavior. And so affiliative sits on the people side, again, of our circumplex. So That is to say, they rated their affiliative behavior around the 50th percentile, but when others reported on them, it was actually lower in terms of how they felt their interactions were. So that's K2. That was the first team of 6 that I put together. Then on the right, I have Team Eiger, also the people, as you might want to call them, because they're on the people hemisphere bias of the LSI1 and LSI2. So you'll see when I pull up their composite scores for these two teams very clearly that there is a bias both in the LSI1 and LSI2 for both of these teams, either for the red or for the green. So for our friends, the Eiger group, they had much stronger passive defensive styles in LSI1 and 2, a little above the 50th percentile, but that was especially pronounced in the approval, which is the number 3 position, and dependent at number 5. Their constructive average scores was at the historical median in LSI2, just the same as our K2 team. But interestingly, their self-perception was lower. So they didn't see themselves, or they didn't back themselves to be as constructive as others actually felt them in their interactions, which I thought was interesting. It's kind of a way of being a bit self-depreciating. You know, they're hanging out a bit more in the bottom half of the circumplex with quite strong extensions around number 5, which means they're kind of in a self-preservation mode. I'm not really doing as well as I'm thinking a little bit less of myself in some senses. So they weren't allowing themselves to acknowledge this strength.
Yeah. It's a fascinating difference between when we look at security orientation versus aggressive versus passive. There's typically an error in judgment around things like our capabilities. So with in terms of performance, just as sort of a broad aside, like aggressive defensive psychological patterns, we tend to overestimate our performance, our capabilities, right? And with passive patterns, you find the opposite, where we tend to underestimate ourselves, lack that confidence, and so on.
Brilliant. So that's
interesting patterns.
Spot on. So that's exactly what played out. Yeah. And it was really, you know, the distinction, you've just highlighted it brilliantly. So between our power team, they thought we're best friends with everybody. We love interacting. We're so affiliative. They don't know what to do with themselves. We're so affiliative. I sound very Trump right now. I'm very sorry. So, and our Eiger team was much more, I don't know if I'm quite good enough. I'd like to be, but I'm not quite sure. So there was quite a distinct feeling between these two teams. It's very easy to see it now on paper. If you had all 11 individuals in the room, you wouldn't have immediately put them into these categories. You might have thought, yeah, they're quieter or they're more boisterous, but it wasn't obvious. It was coming through on the LSI. That's how we saw it. Okay, so I'm going to give us the composite LSI 1 and 2 of the two teams respectively. So here we have K2, power. I'm calling them also the alphas because they were very dominant. So what you see here, and I won't dwell too much because almost it's more interesting as I flip to the next side, you'll see the movement in color. So here we have the guys that are sitting much stronger outside on the red in both the LSI1 and their self-perception and the perception of others in the LSI2. There's very little green amongst them, really, compared to what we're seeing in the red. And there's, if we look at number 2, affiliative, we do see this slight misalignment between how they see themselves and how others see them. So I jump to the next one. We're going to see all of those reds kind of rush out the other side into the greens. So there we go. So that was, we saw the circumplexes move over. So you do see this weighting down towards 6 and 5 at the bottom of the circumplex, especially in the LSI2 for these individuals. And you see quite markedly the blue self-perception is markedly lower, if I go back, than our friends in K2. But yet, if we have a look at LSI2 here on the right for the people, and we go back to the power, you'll see they're similar. Power is a bit more on the achievement side, on the task side, and constructive hang out a little bit more on the people side for the people team in the LSI2. So much for the visuals. That kind of makes it very clear. So I'm going to take a pause and go into a little bit on the content. So that was the process. Now let's talk about the context of what these survival simulations are all about.
Nice.
So perhaps some people are hearing about these for the first time. And because I can't interact with you guys, I can't find out. But let's assume that some of you don't know anything about the survival simulation. So let me give you a little bit of context here. So you have a situation which is described, usually outside the expert field of knowledge of your participants, and they are asked to decide which items on a given list are most and least important for their survival. They do this first independently, with no reference points except the materials provided, and they come then into a team of 5 or 6 people and have to find a common ranking. So teams that come together in a synergistic fashion, kind of leaning on each other, listening, respectfully challenging, and offering alternate advice, generally will improve on their score over where the best team member ended up by themselves. That's to say that they're going to take all the best bits of knowledge and make an even better outcome. Teams that fail to have a process which is constructive are far more likely to destroy value. That is that they're going to disregard input from the team members who turn out to have the best ideas on how to handle this survival simulation. Yes, it can happen that teams with terrible process get lucky and improve without good conduct. But even there are really good lessons which can be extracted. So personally, I use the reef survival simulation, which is in the Tasman Sea between New Zealand and Australia, or one about a bushfire scenario in the Victorian Dandenong Ranges. It's very poor timing to be talking about fires given the tragedy in California, so I apologise there. But I actually come from Victoria, which is in Australia, which is a very fire-prone, like much of Australia, part of the country. And building for bushfire safety was part of my syllabus in geography at high school, so it kind of feels quite close to home for me. And here in Europe, until recently at least, people don't have inherent knowledge about wildfires really and what to do. So the one I used with this team was indeed bushfires. I created some additional materials to help people visualize what's going on. I actually found a video of a news report online about bushfire in Victoria and the Chief Fire Authority lieutenant talking about what people should be doing. And it's kind of a nice preface into the bushfire scenario. Both those simulations that I talked about, both the reef and the bushfire, it comes down to a stay or a go question, which is going to give you the best chance of survival. And interestingly, how quickly teams can realize that this is the fundamental question to be resolved and then get on with evaluating the options to stay or go, rather than debating the list of items, is critical. So that's a fascinating part of the process, watching how teams unpick what actually the challenge at hand is. So that's the setup. That's what they were now about to be asked to do. So I'm quite sure if you took a piece of paper now and you said, what do you think K2, the power, are going to do in this situation? How well are they going to be constructive and listen to each other? What's the mood going to be like in the team? What are the outcomes? And you did the same for people, and you put down, you could even put down fail or succeed. You may or may not be surprised at what happens. So let's see. So here's to our red side, our power side, K2. So the conversation was absolutely lively and animated. There was a lot of banter. The mood was jovial. The language was forceful and direct, however. They were talking over each other. There was a lot of repetition of ideas without acknowledging each other's inputs. Talking was 80% of the interaction for sure. There were no experts, but one had military experience, and his opinions were drowned out by everyone else, quite frankly. They effectively, though, dragged each other kicking and screaming to a consensus prioritization of the items. It was painful, to watch. I had to issue a cataclysmic fire alert. You guys have to make the decision now. You've got 5 minutes left. It's always funny interacting with these teams. But they were very into it. It was great. Now let's have a look at the green side more, the green and the blue side, the people. They were quite quiet and quite subdued. There was a little bit of uncertainty about how to start. They were hesitant to be the one to call the shots or kind of take a leadership role. The team contemplated a lot. There were blank spaces in their conversation. They were laughing and smiling, but they were quite measured. They knew each other very well. Some of these people had worked together for 20 years, but they were still a little bit measured. Listening was 80% of the interaction, where talking was 80% of the interaction for the power side. There were 5 people, so they were marginally smaller. There were no experts in the group. And the boss was part of this team. But her LSI had this choking so-called bow tie of 9 to 3. And that is talking about she had extensions pretty much in her LSI 1, slightly to a lesser degree, but still quite strong extensions in her LSI 2 between competitive behavior and approval behavior. So she was constantly oscillating between wanting to push forward and see that things were getting done. It's the most extreme version of the task side of the circumflex, coupled with, oh, but you're still my friend. It's okay. I haven't upset you. And so she was constantly dealing with this push and pull, these frustrations, coupled with this sort of mea culpa kind of behavior in her own interactions. And she was actively in this session trying to move a lot of those behaviors into a more affiliative style. So her actions in this group, I think, were quite important. Excuse me again. So if you go back to the little pieces of paper where you made that little note, success and failure, you may be dead right. So let's see what actually happens. It's not going to be a surprise. So K2, the power guys, they underperformed versus their 2 highest team members. That is to say, they destroyed the inherent value that was brought into the team exercise by 2 of their members. They completely chose the wrong outcome, but were adamant that it had to be right. Iger, on the other side, the people, they outperformed their best individual score by a massive 40%. Synergistic decision-making enabled them to improve on their individual efforts by a huge margin. It came from a very different they all came from very different thinking to an outcome which put them in a good place for survival. So to me, this was the starkest outcome. So there was no surprise. So I asked them what this meant for how they ran their division. If this was what the leadership team was doing as they sought to get the best business outcomes for their function, what was likely to be the outcome for the business? And what were their subordinates learning as behavioral references? Was might really right? Do you have to be the loudest in the room to get your point across? And critically, just because you're intelligent, well paid, and have a big title, does it mean you have all of the best knowledge in every situation? So what happened, I asked the team in K2. One of the most boisterous and cranky guys on their team offered up. Well, it was obvious, he said. Iger was able to really hear and appreciate each other, whilst we just wanted to pound the table until everyone had bent to our will, which was never going to happen because we were all expecting the same thing. And then I paraphrase what he said, and I think there were a few expletives when he transcribed it, and he was probably, using even more hand signals than me. But it was a moment of reflection where they then sat there for a second and said, yeah. So it was profound. They laughed, but it absolutely hit home for them, which was very positive.
That's fantastic. That's one of the things, and I'm biting my tongue. There are so many fantastic points here, but one of the fun things about those simulations is that as people get into trying to solve that problem, they end up doing so in the same ways and with the same kinds of approaches that they're using in their day-to-day work in the organization. And while that's fun, what's more helpful is if we can measure those behavioral patterns with LSI and show them, and they can, right? There's this aha moment where they suddenly realize, now I can see the way we've been working, and now I have a consequential example of how working in that way, yes, may bring some benefits, but it's also bringing some real, we're destroying value, we're missing good ideas, we're failing to solve problems as effectively as we could. And suddenly, not only do they see in this instance where that happened, but the real light bulb is when they recognize, oh, and that also happened last week when we got together, and last month, that this is a pattern in terms of how we work, and it has a consequence that hopefully we can learn from.
Absolutely. And setting them up for success and then having them steamroll over that and go back to behaviors
Yes.
is a nice way for them to understand that they actually have to be active in this process of trying to shift their behaviors.
Conscious,
It's
yeah.
not something they can be aware of and go, oh yeah, but I'm aware of it, therefore it means I've changed. It actually takes conscious steps to adjust your behaviors and have these reflection points.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, it's one of the challenges, right? One thing is having good information and being able to learn from that. The other big step that you're right, people, oftentimes underestimate is putting that into practice. Now that I understand this, how am I going to take those baby steps moving forward and actually start doing things differently with consistency? And that sounds easier than it is. Yeah.
Correct. And I think for this particular client, there were two parts of that process. So one was at the end of the session, if you recall the agenda that I set up, we made a charter. So I said, okay, so what does this mean? What does this mean your management team meetings look like? What does this mean your meetings with your subordinates look like? And we set up some expected behavioral outcomes and ways of doing things that they were then going to adhere to. And the second part was to continue the coaching journey with each of those individuals to work on their personal behavioral and thinking shifts.
Yeah, very important. Excuse me. Sorry, before you go forward, we have a question. Let me pull that up. Here we go. So was there also a division between men and women in the power/people teams?
Helen, fantastic question. Thank you very much. This actually was a team that was interesting in its structure because the only woman in the team was the boss. So I would have said yes or no, depending on different circumstances, but experience of using these tools over years says I don't always see that the men are more comfortable in the power space and the women less so, because the boss actually had quite strong power outcomes on her LSI1 and LSI2. The big gap for her really was she didn't see herself as nearly as constructive as others saw herself. So she was in this sort of difficult zone of, beating herself up, I think is the best way. Knowing professionally that she was extremely competent and, very, very well accepted in the organization and extremely appreciated. But she was not working at her most productive. She was oscillating between I have to please everybody to I have to get the right outcomes, and the only way I could do that is with force. So good question. Thanks, Helen.
Yeah, it is a good question. I remember when I was in the research department of human synergistics, I was very interested in those kind of demographic categories and whether we saw differences in thinking and behavior as a result or, associated. And you can look at the reliability and validity reports. There are some very, very slight differences across gender, but it's amazing how small they really are. And it speaks to the fact that it's really not about men in teams being more aggressive than women in teams. What it boils down to is what is expected of us, what is role modeled and encouraged of our people here. If we encourage people to compete and work against each other, you're going to get that from everybody, whether they're men or women or regardless, right? And those are the real driving factors. So, good question. Thank you. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to type them into the chat.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. All right, so let me jump quickly into the learnings. I've done 2 slides, learning for the client and learning for me. So for the client, I think the learnings were our behaviors impact others. full stop. If we beat the table to get attention, then why should we expect others to do differently? Listening is a skill, not just something that happens when you can't think of anything to say. Brute force, or more specifically power, doesn't usually win the day, or at least not forever. Being nice and having an interest in people doesn't equate to being a pushover or not focused on real business outcomes. You need to have an understanding of both the hard, the task, and the soft, the people skills. And the big one was you rarely have all of the information. So thinking that you know better than others, plain and simple, and assuming that you do is likely consistently to be a fool's game. So what about learnings for me? Because I'm guessing we may have quite a few consultants like myself on this space. What have I taken away? So thinking of the client's journey, as I guess many of us do, as sort of layers of an onion which need to be unpeeled, is kind of a nice analogy for me. You know, you get some tears in between, a bloody finger now and then. You need to slow cook them to get, you know, the nice proper flavor. Probably too much of the analogy, but knowing that you're going to have to go through processing one layer after the other, you can't kind of, you know, chop it in half and feed someone the whole onion. You have to take the process. Giving the client space and grace to see the learnings for themselves. Don't assume that you have to tell them what you're seeing. Let them see it for themselves. That way their understanding will be more personal and more profound. Keeping things fun while still professional helps embed the learnings. People learn and retain best when they have an emotional connection to what it is that they're unpacking. I find that's very true with the survival simulations. I've come across clients who have sent me messages after terrible bushfires in Portugal many years ago, and actually was part of this team as well that sent them to me saying, did you see people got into the swimming pool and they survived, they were fine. So there's this connection to the experience of this fun exercise that people say, oh, okay, so even if they don't immediately rate, okay, but we did badly, there's the link there that starts to bring them back to some of the things they experienced and understood in that moment. For me, an important one is believing in the tools and actually believing in my knowledge of the tools, knowing when someone is going to challenge you because they don't like what you're reporting to them from the tools, and understanding what that's all about and being secure in the knowledge that you can support them, and trusting in the process. Also believing in my abilities. Sorry, you want to go in there, John?
No, please. Didn't mean to interrupt.
I was just going to say, believing in my abilities to hold their attention and help them extract the learnings that they need, to keep pace with them, even though I don't do their job, to know that I know what I'm doing and that they have asked me for help. I think that's kind of the critical learnings I've taken away over the years that I'm kind of trying to build up my confidence with. So that takes me to the end. I would gladly answer any questions that people may have.
Yeah, please feel free to type any questions into the chat and we'll be able to answer those and read those out. So thank you to anyone who does. As people are hopefully typing, just thinking about your learnings from the that session, you know, those are a lot of the learnings that I've have also come to realize over the years. The first one around, you know, taking them through each layer of the onion is something that I really have had to control myself with. What I mean is, and I hate to say this in this way, this may sound a little crass, but you know, with good instruments, and that really is human synergistics focus, we can measure factors of, you know, teamwork, organizational culture that are really phenomenal, and we can tell an organization so much about what are the actual values here, what is the current pattern playing out, how is that affecting our people, how's that influencing safety and our customer experience, where is that coming from, how are leaders driving this. You know, you can answer sort of in a way all of the questions, if you will, within that structure and framework of the organization. But frustratingly, in a way, we have to be very careful, I've noticed, to slow down and make sure that we're only answering one question at a time for the
Yes.
client. They need to get very clear on, for example, where are we going? What do we need from our people moving forward? What are the values? What is that North Star? And once we're very clear and committed to that, then we can take the next step forward around, how am I currently behaving? Does that match? If not, where are the gaps? And very carefully break this journey down so that we can guide them forward, and they can take those steps in an informed and sort of progressive way. That's very key.
I think that's right. I mean, the Human Synergistics tool suite is so data intense. And if you have these individuals who are sitting more on the task side of the circumplex, they're likely to basically go for the jugular. I see that. I want that. Tell me more. You're not giving me all the information at once. I want. And that's
Yes.
where I rely on you and understand the tools, where you say, no, I know why you want to go in there, but it's my job to keep you out of those details. It's my job to focus on those
Right.
pieces that are important to start this
Exactly.
journey, the next stage of the journey.
Exactly. I mean, really, any of our reports, there's really almost too much information in any of them. It needs to be broken. And this is the reason the reports are delivered, not to the participants themselves, but to the accredited practitioner, so that, you not only can you have an understanding of that report, but really so that we're breaking down and giving those individuals the key pieces that they need, when they need them, to give them the context. And again, that makes sense. And then to build the journey forward from there. It's key.
Absolutely.
And another one of your points later was to trust in the tool, and hate to harp on it, but I agree with you. And it goes back to something I really, in a way, struggled with when I joined Human Synergistics, 17 years ago in the research department, was, really getting the confidence and the comfort level in terms of not only understanding what the tools are, but really understanding that these tools really are accurate and demonstrating what is truly going on within these teams and real patterns.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is so wonderful that, not just with speaking to the quality of the tool, but what I mean is it's a wonderful thing for you as a consultant or a coach, because you know that what is in that report is accurate, it is true, it is something that you can communicate with confidence, and it is something that if your client can take steps to create change in those areas, you will see improvement in their experience, in their performance outcomes, and so on. It will happen. It's not a question of whether this is reality. It's a question of, can we understand this and can we act on it? And that, that truth is also powerful for your client, because that means that, again, what they're looking at is telling them something real. By the way, that goes to one of your second point around, allowing the client to sort of connect with their profiles and their own, because I've never had a client look at a profile and say, no, that's not us. Even if it's very not what they hoped for, they look at it every time and go, yeah, damn it, that's true. And that is, that's face validity, but that's a reflection of, this really is true, and for better or for worse, we can recognize ourselves in it. And again, that reality of now we're seeing the facts and what's really playing out, again, is a huge help to clients, not only in terms of the fact that they can believe in and buy into this information, but again, that means if they can commit to taking actionable steps and improvement, we're going to see improvement for them and their organization. And it's really just a matter of time, as long as clients take steps forward. And I think the fact that the tools are so well tested and validated, again, is huge. I always say that's sort of the invisible advantage to human synergistics tools, because people can't see, if you will, the quality of the correlations of the research behind the instrument. But I think they certainly experience the difference when they receive that report. They can recognize that team behavior clearly. That's us. They can understand now how that's affecting them, and they can more effectively put measured and improvement into practice moving forward. So fun
Fabulous.
stuff.
We've got two questions in there. I don't know
Love
if
your
you
learnings.
pop up the first one from Helen. How do you ensure what has been highlighted lasts for the senior team? Aren't old behaviors quite dominant? So I think this is a great question. And I think the first part of how I would answer this, Helen, is People are only going to change if they want to change. So you can tell them, listen, you're behaving like Trump and being power driven in all your interactions, and other people see it. They might go, yeah, but you know what? I'm paid a lot of money and I'm really successful, so I don't care. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen because certainly in financial services, we have historically rewarded a lot of stuff that sits on the task side of the circumflex. It's always been seen to be, this is how we get stuff done. So the first question is that individual seeking to change? Or have they been told that they have to do this lifestyles inventory tool and receive the feedback and have 2 coaching sessions and then they withdraw? Right? If it's the latter, you're going to struggle to get a shift. If they are engaged in the process, partly because the leader is engaged in the process and is talking about, this is what I expect to see from all of you, you're more likely to get the buy-in. And as soon as people kind of open up a little bit to the process, they start to see the parts of themselves that they've wanted to shift for a while but didn't really know how, because it doesn't just play out in our professional life, it also plays out in our life with our peers and our friends and our family. So people will come to the decision to shift if they're sort of intrinsically motivated to do so. There may be some external kind of prods. So old behaviors are dominant only in the sense that we're practiced at them. It doesn't mean that they have to stay in place.
And from my side, there's the great coaching that can be done around that. Once clients are clearer on what those historic patterns are that may have been getting in the way, or simply moving forward are no longer helpful. It's interesting to ask them questions around, why did we do that? What were the benefits of doing that in the past? How can we change? It gives them that a clear reference point in terms of the status quo up until now, and now moving forward, even though we have good reasons for why we did those things in the past, moving forward, in order to get a different outcome or a different result, we need to do something differently. And that's what I love about HS tools, is really fundamentally, regardless of what tool we're looking at, we're essentially measuring behavioral patterns. It's how people approach their work, it's how people work together, and those are the things that directly affect their ability to best perform. So when we talk about clients, and as you said, we can't force anyone to change. They have to want this, and these tools serve as good information and a guide forward in terms of building that journey based on good information. Usually when clients come to us, there are 2 broad reasons why they're interested in change. That has to do with things like performance and well-being. We need people to be more productive, service customers more effectively, more creative and adaptive, more engaged, those kinds of aspects of well-being and performance. Or it's values-based, right? We have very clear values, and we recognize we're not quite living those values, and we need to understand why that is and start to close that gap. And a lot of that, of course, all comes back to the tool you've been highlighting, LSI 1 and 2, looking at the psychological and behavioral patterns of individuals. And individuals in leadership teams, of course, how they behave is observed by others, role modeled, recognized, and carries on. And I've always found, we talk about composite profiles, which you used, I always find them very, very interesting, because really, if you use LSI with 50 different people from all different companies in a nice random sample, you typically get a profile very close to the norm 50th percentile. It's random data. But when you create composites within organizations and within leadership teams, as you start to notice distinct patterns. And what that's telling you is that our people aren't behaving as independent individuals. We have a trend and a pattern in this organization or in this team across our people. And that is something that goes back to the origins of human synergistics. The LSI was created in the 1970s, and it was really much later that we began getting into especially things like organizational culture. And you touched on exactly one of the reasons why. Because by measuring psychological and behavioral patterns of individuals, in our research, we were able to recognize that organizations are systemically, not all of them, but many organizations are systemically encouraging counterproductive behavior.
Yeah.
We're actually doing things in the company to encourage behavior that takes away from our people and their ability to perform. And if we can understand that, if we can measure that, if we can help organizations to understand that, obviously, that's the kind of very clear opportunity to develop. We shouldn't be encouraging our people to do things that causes them to waste time, lose ideas, and perform less effectively. We need to get clear on what helps and leads us forward, and focus on growing that. Sorry, off on all kinds of tangents, but you're touch on a lot of cool points. Yeah, absolutely.
Good tangents. I'm just going to respond to Carl's question.
Sorry.
So Carl asked, the decision to divide the groups along LSI profiles, did you handle it openly? This is a good question. So I handled it openly post the exercise. So I said, why do you think I put you 6 guys together? Why do you think I put you 5 together? And that was part of the unpacking of the conversation. Obviously, I didn't show them their LSI composites for the 6 and the 5. I didn't have it created that way. We've done that subsequently. But explaining to them that when I put the 6 of you in the room together, and it could have been the 5 of you and 1 of them, or it could have been slightly different configuration, that the individuals in that group have pushed the outcome in this particular way. So it's about those individuals reflecting on what was my contribution.
Absolutely.
I actually did, I think, reef survival simulation back in November with another company, and it was a very large group. We had 12 teams, and there was a management table. And so the manager said, oh, no, we'll sit this one out. Oh, no, do you want us split into the groups? I said, no, I don't want you split into the groups. I want you by yourselves. Because if you fail or succeed, I expect you to have the humility for me to be able to draw out the lessons for the rest of the group based on your behaviors, because we coupled that particular exercise with the group styles inventory. So they also then reflected on how they felt the behavior of each of the contributing members in their team was as they tried to unpack and solve for the survival simulation. And processing then the data pretty quickly and moving through it, I was then able to say, well, how did you interact with each other, and what did this mean for your outcomes, and what, who was the expert around the table? Supposedly one of you was a sailor. What did that mean? I heard these conversations. So I think there's a lot of benefit actually in being conscious about how you split the groups. I had no LSI details for the teams that I did back before Christmas, but putting all of the managers together was a nice contrast, and all of the rest of the teams sort of had a senior, middle, junior staff. So they had a mix, and none of them were intact teams, which of course is another way to do it. Put an intact team together to see what their existing behaviors are. So there's no right or wrong way, but I think whatever way you do it, make that decision and lean into it. And if you are going to call out the managers by putting them together, for example, make sure that they're on board with that, because you don't want a group of managers feeling picked on. Yes, I think that would be how I could best summarize that.
Very, very nice.
Probably a good place to end. I don't know. What do you think, John? Unless you have
Yeah, well, I had one more question, honestly, from my side. I wanted to make sure that we didn't have any other lingering. And that, is a common question that we have with regard to, well, really all reports, I suppose, on some level. And, well, when we talk about measuring psychological and behavioral patterns, we don't talk about any of those patterns as being inherently right, wrong, good, or bad. We can measure and understand how those patterns affect performance and well-being. We can have the client describe what they would like taking place, their own values, and compare things in that way. But in any case, one of the challenges people run into a bit is how do we bring these profiles across in a way that people don't perceive this as some form of criticism, if you see what I'm saying, right? Because we're highlighting both patterns that are enabling and functional and help us to move forward and get things done and solve problems effectively. And also we're measuring patterns of behavior that might be getting in the way, distracting us from our best work, causing us to miss good ideas. And while that's not inherently wrong, it's important people learn from that. That's one of the differences about HS tools from many other. A lot of other tools will sort of only give you good news, if you will. What are your strengths? What are your competencies, your capabilities? And I think we avoid looking at something that might be a stumbling block in a way, just so we don't have to bring across that potential kind of perspective. Human Synergistics has always found it very important, and it's been very clear that we're not only measuring and communicating those behaviors and patterns that are helpful and contribute and enable you to perform at your best, but it's also important for people, if we're using a true scientific diagnostic, that people understand not only what is helpful and working, but what is getting in the way, what's holding us back, what is potentially detracting from us being at our best. So we have to give both sides of that. So anyway, sorry for going on too long, but how do you preface that, or deliver that in a way that people, aren't taking this as good news, bad news, basically?
I think you used a lot of the verbiage in there that I would use with clients as well. I just talk about helpful or unhelpful. I say, how do you feel that this has actually impacted you? Where do you think this has held you back? What do you think the cost is of doing this versus doing something that's perhaps more constructive? And why are you using it right now? And of course, I think we've all come across clients where I had a client several years ago when I asked them to do their ideal OCI, so organizational cultural inventory, to describe their perfect wheel. They sat heavily in this defensive space because that was the reading that they received from the rest of the organization at the time. They thought a really good cultural outcome for them was to be in a defensive space. So I think it has to be, any feedback that you're giving a client has to be weighed up against what's the context in which they're working, what are they trying to achieve, where can you lean into the support for them as an individual, really critically as an individual. And it very often comes down to situations where you ask them to reflect, okay, how did that help you or hurt you? What was a positive outcome of that? And so I often work with this, how is this helping or hurting? It's not good or bad. It might not be everything that you wanted it to be. So maybe it's holding you back.
Right. Yeah. Love it.
Yeah. I see Carl's just put up one final question. Was there a fight about who outperformed who? And I could say there's always a fight about who outperformed who. The good news is with these tools, you have this straight up numbers, which says, well, you had one guy that performed at this level and one lady that performed at this level, and you managed to shred those good outcomes.
Those good ideas.
And get to somewhere much worse. So there's seldomly a fight. But there's always good banter and conversation about why it worked or didn't work. And to me, that's where the power of this comes together, because back to my learnings and the learnings for the consultants, learning for the clients, you don't have to tell them. They've felt it. They have just spent 45 minutes trying to get their head into this, put themselves in a boat that's been wrecked on a reef, or put themselves into a little house with 5 of their co-workers, and a bushfire is coming from somewhere. So they've immersed themselves into the feeling, the understanding. They've had these 12 items. They've wrestled with what is the right outcome. And when you say, but this happened or that happened, some of them are going to push back and debate and say, yeah, but I read somewhere that this is a better outcome. I was like, I appreciate that. But in this particular case, this is not what the right outcome was. And when you also see that kind of defensive behavior and very much, okay, back to the tools. What do I understand about these tools? What is this individual's likely self-perception? So where is this coming from? How do I need to support them as they try and unpack what they've just learned? Because whilst I'm not I'm not a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, I don't have that kind of a background. I can see the humanity in this person and what they're wrestling with. So it's always fun. I love using those tools, and I don't get to use them enough.
Agreed.
I think that the challenge is, once you've had this experience, how do you get the client to move forward and think more about what's just happened and embed some of that thinking going forward? And it's definitely around following up with coaching, following up with, a group styles inventory after, maybe some other event or some other things that have been particularly critical for them. Yeah, I think that would be,
Fantastic.
yeah, what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've always loved the transparency of the tools, especially at the team level with simulations. So, maybe just for a little reference, when we're talking about LSI or GSI, those are instruments really, again, essentially, and in very brief terms, measuring behavioral patterns of the individual or team. The simulations are basically a problem-solving exercise that are completely separate, but were developed by human synergistics originally to look at things like how do teams behave and how do those patterns influence their ability to solve problems and right and come up with an effective strategy and so on. And it's fascinating how it plays out, but the transparency that it gives you once they've gone through that organic exercise is then we can really in almost frightening detail track back how that team performed. Right, we can look at, as you said, we had 5 people in our team. 2 of them came up with a better solution than the team came up with. How did we miss those ideas and points? And you can really track it right back to the actions. I think it's even I think it's Stanford University in the U.S. uses these tools and simulations and actually videos the session. I've had clients do this as well, and you can actually see the moment that somebody says, hey, well, what about this idea? And somebody, oh no, that'll never work. And there's there's that behavior. And anyway, you can really see the whole cause and effect of it and a very tangible experience. And I always find that catches people's attention because they really can see here's when we took this action and here's the consequence of that in this particular case.
Just to elaborate on that, I think that's very important when you also see the individuals who had the good ideas
Yes.
and they get to
Yes.
reflect and say, well, what was my role there and why was I not more forceful, or why didn't I continue to follow up, or what were my actions in that particular? So it's not always that the people who push those ideas off to the side, it's also the reflection for the individual who had the good ideas and perhaps didn't back themselves or
Absolutely.
didn't find a way to articulate themselves. And this is often where in those conversations you bring up, how are you landing as an individual, irrespective of everything else that's going on around, which is a nice reflection point to come out when
Absolutely
all is said and done at the end of the simulation.
Yeah. Fascinating. And one last point from my side, I hate to, but when you broke out those 2 groups, you had the one you described as more task oriented, and the other which was more interpersonal on the right hand side of the model. And what we know from team dynamics is that those behavioral patterns in the profile predict the skills that people will likely utilize when they're trying to solve problems. So the left-hand side of the model, task-oriented behavior, encourages and enables people to use rational skills. So things like breaking problems down into smaller pieces, creating a clear strategy forward, considering alternatives, those sorts of structural important skills. At the same time, on the right-hand side, those interpersonal behaviors enable and facilitate people to use interpersonal skills, things like listening to one another, constructively differing, and so on. I mean, in very simple terms, it's not that complex. If we want our teams to solve problems most effectively and perform most effectively, we need the people in those teams to utilize both rational and interpersonal skills. We need to both plan ahead and consider alternatives. And in order to know what those alternatives are, we need to listen to people's ideas and ask for their input. We need both. And that's what predicts high performance in teams. And what you see in the first group is one that's leaning toward task orientation. They will utilize rational skills, create structure, and so on, but they may fail to, ask the quiet person in the group for their ideas or to really fairly and equitably compare ideas across members. And they'll suffer for that in their overall solution quality and actually in their own perception of how the team performed. The other team that's more interpersonal will be more effective at sort of sharing ideas, listening, and so on, but may struggle to come up with okay, here's our structure, first, second, third, what we're going to do, here's our strategy, and so on. So again, those patterns predict the skills that your members will have. And it's a whole topic I'm not going to get into, but it's very frustrating when you look at organizations because we hire and select people based on the experience, the knowledge, the skills that they have. And we then bring them into organizations and teams based on that right, undermine their ability to leverage those skills. You may hire people and have people in the team with fantastic interpersonal skills, but if we're working together in this very task oriented way, then people can't leverage those skills and they suffer in terms of their ability to deliver. So understanding that structure is always amazing, and the predictive nature I've always found really, really fun as well, because you can really see and observe it as you're doing this. And that's my last point about simulations and really GSI as well. Is those are the only tools from human synergistics that you can really observe the behaviors playing out and see and measure their consequence and effect on the well-being, motivation of the people, as well as their ability to solve that problem effectively. And there's a fascinating threshold where, yes, if we can behave and work in more constructive ways, utilizing those skills, we can be most effective. But there's an interesting threshold where once behavioral patterns in teams and groups becomes defensive enough, you actually get to a point where teamwork is counterproductive, meaning in a
Yeah.
way, and we actually measure this, right? Your average
Yeah.
individual, having left the task up to a random member would have been better, because
Yes.
the way our team works is primarily detracting from the
Yes.
ability of the group to work effectively. And that's really the threshold where teamwork becomes, counterproductive rather than productive.
And that's
Again, that's
amazing
neither.
aha
Yeah,
for
yeah.
us.
And again, framing that in a way that's not good or bad, but here's where you are and here's the effect it's having. And if we want to change that moving forward, we need to do some more of these sorts of things. And that's the message that needs to be taken away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed
No, thank
it.
you so much. This was fun.
That.
I really, really loved all of your input and touched on so many great points. I could go on for longer. It's been great. I hope we should do this again. It's been really, really nice. Thank you so much for the insights. I know
Thank
everyone learns from this because, I've got the HS hat on with the research and data and tool perspective, but that's not enough. Delivering reports doesn't create real change. It has to be understood, broken out, and debriefed, and a journey built, and coaching happen. So it really is a team effort. So thank you so much for your collaboration and creating good things and changing the world with HS.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you very
It's a
much.
pleasure. Very nice.
Bye-bye,
All the
everybody.
best for 2025. Thank you, and greetings to everyone. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Look forward to the next one. All right. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye-bye.